It's Kirby Sommers, and today we're going to be looking at someone who really has not come under scrutiny, and that would be Diane Sawyer. Diane Sawyer has sort of become news again because of her interview, and I'm using that word very loosely, with Eileen Ford. Now, some people have been diving into that interview, and I'm going to be sharing a lot of information with you. And basically, I'm doing so because I think many of you know that I've been working on a 2-volume series, Gerald Ford, MK Ultra, and many of you have been, well, many of you already have volume 1. It's available on my website, kirbysummers.com. And volume 2 will be available shortly. However, no one seems to have talked about the reason why, let's say, this interview took place until I guess I'm doing so today. And I think people who have been pulling up let's say, this interview that happened I'm trying to let me just find my notes here. So it was here's the thing. I wonder still why so much of mainstream has basically been swallowed up by most of us, and why instead collectively we do not take a more, let's say, different approach to any of these so-called exposés, such as Diane Sawyer's 1988 interview with Eileen Ford for 60 Minutes in an episode titled American Girls in Paris. Now, what people have done, and what I see this interview popping up as a conversation piece, which sort of was really done to hide Eileen Ford. And by the way, Eileen Ford's daughter, Katie Ford, whose husband at one time was Andre Balazs, those two people are in J.E.'s Black Book. Now, I just want to remind or tell those of you who are new to my channel that there are certain names that are highly sensitive on this platform, and therefore I will have to use initials. But I think those of you who are listening and those of you who are even new to my channel will know who J.E. is. So the fact of the matter is that Eileen Ford was very much connected to that same world that I have been sharing with you. What I've been sharing are the layers beneath and how it goes back into history and other people that have not been named. So the IMBD page describes Sawyer as investigating claims of SA by French model scouts Claude Haddad and Jean-Luc Brunel. How teenage girls aspiring to become models were targeted by these older men. And we've seen this interview, most of us more than once, where these model scouts also shared their young teenage females with other men and how they were made to be available for parties, so on and so forth. Among these men, by the way, is Stephen Mnuchin. So what I want to say is that when I upload a preview to my Substack, as I did yesterday and as I do on an ongoing basis, these chapters, when they go into the final book, are not necessarily presented in the same manner. There's additional information that is included. It's rewritten. It follows a very unique discovery thing that it shows the relationships and interconnections between all of these people in a very clear way. So, to present day, however, this clip of this so-called interview and expose appears on various YouTube channels. People say that it is exposing something about the JE transportation ring. And by the way, I have to use the word transportation as opposed to the other word for those of you who may not be aware. And they use it as an acknowledgement of such. But actually, it's not. It's not. It's really a cover up. And I compare it, we've had many cover ups. We've had many peculiar things happen historically within the United States and outside. And I think most of us are aware that, let's say, what happened on that dreadful day in September, on the 11th day, was a false flag meant to do something else. Many people are now becoming aware that what happened when Richard Nixon, and we'll be getting into Richard Nixon, by the way, because he too was connected to JE and to Diane Sawyer, who we will be examining further shortly. The moon landing, where Nixon effortlessly had a telephone conversation. It was really more of a monologue, which you can find. You can find this clip on YouTube of Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, the moon trip, Apollo 11. And by the way, my abuser's father, and frankly his family, owned the company and still own it, Fabergé, which had a subdivision which made the spacesuits for NASA, and which Aldrin and Armstrong and the other guy wore, and they continue to have this partnership with the government where they continue to produce certain items for the government. So that we know that historically we have seen something presented to the public as if it was news presented in a certain way. However, including the unaliving of John F. Kennedy in Dealey Square. And all of this stuff, all of these, including the woman we're looking into today, these are psychological operations. It's meant to steer your mind away from what really happened to another incident, which is then meant to do something else. So that at the same time that this interview was happening between Diane Sawyer and Ford, where she claimed, she had no idea. I think I have the exact quote that she used. And let's see if I can just pull that up so that I can share with you in detail what she said. I'm sure, again, most of you have watched the interview. However, no one has seen it for what it really is. So that she claimed that she had no prior knowledge, meaning Eileen Ford, of the multiple complaints by the girls of their exploitation and substance abuse by Brunel, who later, most of us know, ran the JE-funded MC Square modeling agency. So what was happening, so this aired in December of 1988. And at the same time this was happening, just a couple of months before, there was that article talking about the call boy ring, call boy, that's what the title of the article was, of boys being taken on midnight tours of Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush's White House, spearheaded by CIA spook Craig Spence, who we know was Lawrence Larry King's partner in another so-called ring, which, by the way, they overlap. They have same people as the JE situation and as the one before even Franklin, which I explain more in depth in my work. So Sawyer's interview of Eileen, and by the way, I'm just going to upload a photo of Diane Sawyer with her very good friend, Richard Nixon. So Sawyer's interview of Eileen and the focus on male modeling agents and young teenage girls aired December 1988, as I just mentioned, but it happened just before Ronald Reagan's second presidential administration ended. So that administration ended in January of 1989. And what even when I look at my notes, as you can hear from my pausing and all of this, even I am sometimes like, wow, how come more people are not pointing this out? But in any event, to go back to Spence, he openly boasted about his blackmail operation, as did JE, by the way, except that a lot of people, even to present day, say, oh, he was a liar, which is what they tried to say about Spence. Now, while this is happening, so that as bad as it is to know that 15-year-old girls, 16-year-old girls who don't know anything about the so-called modeling industry, which really is, by the way, not what it purports to be. And in my 2-volume book, Gerald Ford, MK Ultra, I go back into history, really to the turn of the century, and I explain things in a way that once you see what I've shared, you'll be able to connect even more dots that no one has been able to sort of like piece together before. However, at this time, it started to become public what was happening in Omaha, Nebraska, which had connections to Richard Nixon. So, for example, I'm going to share the connections of, first, Diane Sawyer to Nixon. So her birth name was Lila Diane Sawyer. She was born on December 22nd, 1945, and she got her start working for Nixon, whose vice president was Spiro Agnew, until he resigned in 1973 after being accused of criminal conspiracy, bribery, extortion, and fraud. So this guy, Spiro Agnew, this was happening as the Watergate scandal was surfacing, and Spiro Agnew was like, well, I'm out of here. I don't want to be prosecuted for my crimes, which started in his home state of Maryland. And he's like, well, I'm out of here. At which point, Nixon replaced Agnew with Gerald Ford, who, by the way, is a 33-degree Freemason. So Sawyer also worked on the Nixon-Ford transition team in 1974-1975 with Alexander Haig, who was Nixon's chief of staff. Haig would later team up with Ford and another man by the name of Jack Kemp in 1980. I believe it's 1988. I just want to make a little correction here. To sit in on Lawrence Larry King's host committee for his Council of Minority Americans, which sponsored a $100,000 event in New Orleans. Now, New Orleans plays a very big role in the community that we're studying, which means literally the intelligence apparatus of various countries. So I'm going to finish, and I'll just come back to this point about the importance of New Orleans. So, in Nixon's administration, his attorney general and really his lifelong friend, he had worked with this person who I'm going to name in a second before he became president. They are both attorneys, was John Mitchell. And the New York Post reported in 1989 um, that Mitchell attended parties at Craig Spence's house in Washington, D.C. Now, we're talking about the very same Craig Spence who worked with Larry King of the Franklin situation. All right. So in 2003, J.E. told a reporter that he met Stephen Hoffenberg through John Mitchell, who he said was a mutual acquaintance. Now, again, J.E. made a lot of statements, which frankly, when you track down the source and you track down the material and you look at the connections, looks pretty accurate. However, Hoffenberg would later deny this and insist they met through Douglas Leese, a British arms dealer and spy. Once Ford was sworn into office, he gave Nixon a full and unconditional pardon for all the crimes he may have committed during his presidency. So Diane Sawyer, what does she do? She's very loyal to Nixon, who I have just explained has a connection to Franklin, has a connection to J.E. So again, it proves my point that these are not separate as perhaps other people describe them, but they are in fact part of the same apparatus that preceded J.E., preceded Craig Spence, preceded Larry King, and by the way, which continues to present day. Okay. So then Sawyer follows Nixon back to California, where she helped him write his memoir. And she was also very instrumental in preparing him for his televised interview with David Frost in 1977. So basically, Sawyer's interview of Eileen and the focus on male modeling agents and young teenage girls, I think we also have to look at the optics. We have Sawyer, who's a female, and Eileen Ford, another female. And this was before the world started understanding that abuse comes in the guise of a woman, the mother figure, if you will. And the public became very aware of that via Ghislaine Maxwell. And so we have two women. And by the way, when a man is accused of the R word, and I'm going to bring up a very good example, or of a child SA, they will hire a woman. So many years ago, before Hillary married Bill Clinton, she was an attorney. Her name clearly was Hillary Rodham, and she represented a man who was alleged to have R-worded a 12-year-old girl. And she viciously attacked her and her reputation. Now, the reason that men will hire a female attorney is to have sway over the jury pool when these men, few and far between, because it doesn't happen very often, are caught and taken before the court, where again we do have corruption. However, the optics for the jury is that, oh, there's a female representing this man, how bad could he be, right? So we see the optic of Sawyer, and I'm going to put that image up again. I took a screenshot of the interview. So we have a woman talking to another woman. And at this time in 1988, when this aired, you have, again, the mother figure that most people think of as, oh, these are nurturing individuals. And they're talking, and clearly they're talking about men, not women, who are also guilty, as we have seen with Ghislaine, of doing terrible things to children of both male and female, not just female, but male and female. And so there's an optic, you have a visual to sort of like work on your subconscious. And then we have the very real situation that Diane Sawyer was, in fact, very much connected to the same world to which J.E. belonged. Now, J.E., as those of you might know, worked with Stephen Hoffenberg, who I just mentioned, on Tower Financial. It is described as a New York leveraged buyout and collection agency firm. However, John Mitchell, again, Nixon's attorney general, who I just said is alleged to have introduced J.E. to Hoffenberg. Well, John Mitchell also sat on the board of Tower Financial, as did Edward Nixon. So Edward Nixon would be Richard Nixon's brother. And then also there was Richard Nixon's nephew who sat and worked with Tower Financial. Now, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to read an article that was published in 1987, talking about these names, so that you can see that there is that I have receipts for this. So this was published by the LA Times. It's called "Towers Fails to Put Lehman on Airways Board." It was written by a reporter by the name of Robert Dallos. And it reads, Tower Financial's core, a New York leveraged buyout and collection agency firm, on Tuesday named the board of Towers World Airways, a company it had set up for its effort to take over financially troubled Pan Am World Airways. Towers also announced the composition of the new company's board of directors. Its members are former Attorney General John N. Mitchell, Edward M. Nixon, a business consultant and brother of former President Richard Nixon, Abraham Hirschfeld, a New York and Florida real estate developer who once ran for the U.S. Senate from New York, and Representative Thomas B. Evans Jr., who was once co-chairman of the Republican National Committee. Now, what I want to say is that Abe Hirschfeld is my abuser's relative. I explain how my abuser fits into the scheme of things in many of my articles and in my book, Billionaire's Woman, a memoir, again available on my website. It goes on to talk about why Navy Secretary John F. Lehman kind of decided not to be part of this. So that we have clearly a connection to Richard Nixon from both the Franklin people, such as John Mitchell was said to have been very close friends with Craig Spence, and that was reported in more than one article during the time that the Franklin allegations were surfacing. And then we have this connection to J.E., so that there's a lot of overlap, and it's not a mistake and it's not a one-off. It's because we're talking about the same animal. And so I want to go back and share with you a little bit more about New Orleans. Now, and again, I go into more detail in my 2-volume book, Gerald Ford, MK Ultra. I'm very, very proud of this work. I think that I have grown over time. I began doing this on a full-time basis in July of 2019 when J.E. was arrested. And it was, I had my own stuff to bring to the table. You know, I knew a lot about Leslie Wexner. I knew a lot about other players. I had unusual things happen to me. And I'll say that most of the pushback that I've received, while I receive pushback almost on a daily basis, but a lot of it has really been about my expose on Gerald Ford and how he connects to a world that no one's ever um, linked him to, and how he is very instrumental. And again, as my book suggests, and let me just share a cover of volume 2. So that's Gerald Ford, MK Ultra. So we see there on the cover, we see Gerald Ford as president. We see Larry King. Under Ford, I have a photo of Jack Nicholson. And then I have a photo of Johnny Gosch. Now, all of these people, I share how they're connected, how all of these pieces. I decided to use this kind of cover for both of the volumes because I show how these are interlocking pieces of the same thing. Okay. So New Orleans is an important hub for intelligence work. So Eileen Ford and her husband, Gerald Ford, when you look at what I present in the book, it's pretty clear that they're intelligence assets. Now, Gerald Ford was a Jesuit, born in New Orleans, and when you and I include, I include images of the sundial on J.E.'s Little St. James, and I compare it to the Jesuit logo. And while I'm not showing that photo here, you can pull it up online and compare the two, and you'll see that there is a very strong similarity between these two images. And I do not believe it's accidental, so that I believe, frankly, it's a nod to the partnership of the Jesuits with CIA, MI5, MI6, and the Mossad. Okay. Now, this would include secret societies such as the Freemasons, the Knights Templars, and other less known clusters of elite power. So, what sort of New Orleans is like this concentration of really shadowy figures so for example, for the unalivement of John F. Kennedy on November 23rd, 1963, some of the people that were involved in that were New Orleans native Lee Harvey Oswald, David Ferry, Clay Shaw, and Carlos Marcello, the reputed mob boss of Louisiana. But earlier in the 20th century, we have Samuel Zemurray. Let me see if I could just pronounce that. Maybe I can, maybe I can't. Zemurray. Now, he's a Russian Jew. He was born into poverty. He rose to riches selling bananas. And he made New Orleans his home. He was nicknamed Sam the Banana Man. And eventually his company, Cuyamel Fruit, would merge with United Fruit. They did this with the help of the Department of State. So now we have the government very early on, sort of at the turn of the century, helping a corporation merge with another corporation. This would happen many times over because we know that our politicians, frankly, work for large corporations for the interest of corporations, not for the interest of us, the people. We have seen this time and time again. It is time we understand it. It is time that we accept it. So the attorney for United Fruit was Allen Dulles. You may be familiar with that name because he became the director of CIA until he was fired by none other than John F. Kennedy. Now, after Kennedy's unalivement, which was really I'm going to have to spell this word, guys, Satanic. It was an offering on a very interesting place. So when he was unalived in this offering that happened very publicly, which was sort of meant to do several things, that might be worthy of a podcast on its own. So I'm going to save that for another. However, if you have questions about that, put it in the comment section below so that I can use it to formulate another podcast for you guys. So let me just go back. So after the unalivement of JFK, Dulles was placed alongside Gerald Ford to preside over the fraudulent Warren Commission report. I think most people now understand that the Warren Commission, which concluded that, it was a lone gunman and it was a magic bullet. Well, we know that that's not true. Moreover, Leon Black's father, Eli, who I began writing about many years ago, was the CEO of United Fruit at a later point. Now, Eli's body flew out of the 44th window of the Pan Am building in New York City, which I have written about, on February 3rd, 1975. Now, Leon Black went on to co-found Apollo Global Management, and he is also known as JE's second largest financial contributor. Again, I'm going to have to use loose quotes on that. So that I think that you can see, as I have been talking about Diane Sawyer, her interview with Eileen Ford, and her role as a deep state asset. She got her start with Richard Nixon, connected to everything. That in fact, we're looking at a deep state operative working with, frankly, an intelligence operative who would go on to take over something that was started by none other than Gerald Ford. And with that, I do look forward to your commentary. I invite you to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time, guys. Bye.